to say this, and I'm going to say it just once.
This is today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to TNT, today's News Talk. Patrick Henningsen, your host here. We're still in the first hour of this live broadcast. We're going to talk now about international developments over to Europe, to the Netherlands, to The Hague. Everybody witnessed what happened last week. It was historic. South Africa making its appeal to the international courts of justice on behalf of the Palestinian people, making the case that there's genocide happening in Gaza, holding Israel to account. Israel in the dock as well, with its rebuttals the following Friday. And then over the weekend, we saw the jostling back and forth, not only within the institutional setting, but in the media as well. The battle of narratives has begun, but it looks like South Africa is holding the fort on this issue, and it's incredible to look at the reactions on this latest developments. I want to go over to veteran journalist based in Washington, D.C., Sam Husseini is joining us on the line right now. Sam, this has been an incredible event. Thursday was historic. I think this is one of the highest rated web TV broadcasts that the UN has on their digital services. There were rumors that the server was struggling. There was outage. There was downtime. People around the world tuned in, all time zones, to watch this historic moment by South Africa. And then the next day, we didn't see any coverage of it in the mainstream media, or very sparse coverage, Sam. But we saw a lot of coverage of the Israeli session, which was on Friday. Just your reactions on how last week went, and then going forward, how the conversation is developing. Sam Husseini.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. I thought that the South African case was quite strong. They went through, Israel's actions now. Their 84-page application went through the background in terms of prior attacks on Gaza, and they went through the genocidal intent and so on. I think that it certainly hasn't gotten, what it needs to get. But in terms of, on so-called social media and other platforms, it's certainly gotten a great deal. And hopefully this signals a step in the, a reconfiguration of the world, where law actually matters and facts actually matter, and they're not just simply instruments of the most powerful. In South Africa, you couldn't have asked for a better state to do this in terms of the symbolism of it, having, overcome apartheid and colonialism, and having, I should say, hopefully having overcome apartheid and colonialism, because I fully expect that South Africa and the ANC will now come under massive attack. So we need to keep an eye on that. What's part of what's now critical is that other countries need to issue declarations of intervention legal. You've had about 30 countries, mostly in the global south, back South Africa up in terms of, making statements, from Algeria to Brazil to Lebanon and so on. Only a handful, however, have said that they will be making legal declarations. Bangladesh and Colombia. So there needs to be more on that. I wrote a piece outlining how this, what people can do to help make that happen on New Year's Day. So people might want to take a look at that at husseini.substack.com. We also saw, and this is kind of remarkable, there was minimal coverage of the South Africa thing, and then something happened between the South Africa thing and the Israel defense of the genocide charges, and that's that the U.S. bombed Yemen. So you would kind of think it would be the other way around, right? You would have thought that there would be a lot of coverage of South Africa, and then not as much coverage of Israel, both on the merits and also because there's this other major story. So the timing of it seems to me is quite notable, that it would seem to distract from people process. It's like each crime distracts from the previous crime. Don't look at what South Africa is saying at the Hague. We're going to commit this other war crime, I wrote several months ago about invoking the Genocide Convention, and I eventually wrote a piece basically saying they call it genocide, but don't invoke the Genocide Convention, basically taking all these countries to task who had called what Israel's doing genocide. And now we sort of have a domestic U.S. analogy to that. And that is that after Biden bombed Yemen, you had all of these Congress people, Ro Khanna, Democrat, Matt Gaetz, Republican, I would say almost 10 of them, both Republicans and Democrats, saying this is unconstitutional. You can't do that, Joe Biden. You went out and you formed an international coalition or cooperation with all these other states in order to go after the Houthis, and you never went to Congress. You can't say that it's an emergency. You had a month at least to deal with things internationally, and you didn't come to Congress. So saying it's an emergency doesn't pass muster. And I think it's notable that they did that, but none of them will talk about the obvious legal remedy, which is impeachment. That is, impeachment in the United States becomes this political football over, personal issues or personal corruption or relatively provincial matters. But when it really comes down to a real substantial case for impeachment in terms of violating war powers, for example, suddenly no member of Congress has yet stepped forward. And I think that should be a source of, serious push into activism and scrutiny.
It is pretty extraordinary, Sam, that the thing to pursue in the last month would be some sort of talks, de-escalation talks, talk to the Yemenis, saying, hey, look, we're going to speak to Israel. We think it's in the best interest that there is de-escalation in Gaza, especially in light, Sammy, of the fact that it is in the Hague. That it is in the Hague is the perfect opportunity for the Biden. It almost gives the Biden administration an out to talk about de-escalation. I mean, I feel like, Sammy, you've been in Washington for a while, enough to see different administrations and different envoys and different State Department regimes. I feel like this would have been a no-brainer 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. What is happening now?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, certainly, take the invasion of Iraq, for example. The U.S. had lots of opportunities to not do that. Right? They could have come to all kinds of accommodations in terms of what their alleged concerns about Iraq were. But their agenda was to invade Iraq. The U.S. agenda was to destroy Libya. The U.S. agenda was to undermine Syria. That's my interpretation of all of these actions. So I think that this highlights what the actual agenda is, right? The actual agenda. I don't believe that Israel prioritizes in any meaningful way the safety of its own citizens. It prioritizes being an expansionist colonial state, and the U.S. Certainly the Biden administration has backed that up to the hilt. So their claims that they care about all of these other things, they're at best costs, whereas their overriding goal of the U.S. and Israeli establishments is to dominate the region, to dispossess the Palestinian people, and everything else, whether it's the Hamas attack or anything else, becomes a pretext for those ends. They either want people to roll over and be subservient, which is what a lot of Arab governments effectively are, or to fight them in a way that gives them a pretext to be more violent. So, I think that, so I'm very, dubious about the notion that their stated goals are their actual goals. But you're absolutely right. If they wanted, I mean, the Houthis are basically saying, we're only doing this because Israel's committing genocide. right? I mean, the Houthis are effectively doing their own version of responsibility to protect.
Yes,
Uh,
exactly.
they're saying 150 countries around the world. I mean, I don't know if they explicitly say this, but effectively, this is their argument. Said that they wanted a ceasefire in Gaza. Israel is refusing a ceasefire in Gaza. We're going to make a ceasefire in Gaza happen. It was disturbing. And I haven't been able to get a copy of this, interestingly, but the UN Security Council did pass a resolution chastising the Houthis. I don't know the exact wording of it because, as I say, it's been several days, and I haven't been able to obtain a copy of it. But China and Russia abstained on that. And I think that's a matter of scrutiny because quite obviously the U.S. was going to use that, I think, as a pretext, as they have done in the past, right? Every time the UN Security Council, sort of goes along with some U.S. design, whether it's Libya or Syria or wherever, that U.S. uses that as a pretext. If you haven't seen the pattern yet, you're not paying attention. So I think that China and Russia should be questioned as to why they went along and abstained.
Do you think that's possible? The abstentions that's an interesting point, Sammy, and one we'd like to get some answers for. But do you think it's possible that Russia and China abstained because this is a precarious issue for them, or in the future, if they were to engage in the same policy, that it would be a matter of their protecting their position going forward to reserve the right to interdict in the Black Sea, for instance, as an example, or the South China Sea? What do you think that might have something to do with it? Their own sort of geostrategic conundrums that they're embroiled in.
It could be their own, geostrategic, perspective, or it could be, that it could be deal making behind the scenes going on, or something else. I mean, and this goes to the broader question about how the ICJ will rule on South Africa's genocide case, right? You have, the 15 judges, and then, South Africa and Israel both got to pick additional judges. And you had the U.S. currently has the presidency, and there's a Russian judge and a Chinese judge. I mean, some people analyze what the court's going to do in terms of what the geostrategic interests are of each of these countries. So could the Russian government urge the Russian judge to vote against this because they want because they don't want the ICJ to come down too hard on Russia, that they don't want, I mean, the ICJ has already been critical of Russia. So you'd think that it would be the opposite, that they would, if anything, urge the judge to do that. So, there are two different interpretations to what's happening at the ICJ. That is this all just power politics in terms of the interests of each of the countries represented on the court, or is it actually a process to administer justice as it purports? I should say that there were some limitations, in my view, of the South African case that I think opened the door for some things by Israel. For example, the South Africans made no mention of the Hannibal Directive, the Israeli policy of killing their own soldiers, or potentially their own citizens, or potentially other people's citizens, in order to prevent them from being taken hostage or captive. I think highlighting that would tremendously undermine the notion that Israel cares so much about its citizens, which was their total refrain in terms of Hamas is bad, Hamas is bad, Hamas is bad when they presented their case. And you also saw Netanyahu's hysterical speech after the case, the oral arguments were made, and in which he but basically said we don't care what the axis of terror thinks, and we don't care what the Hague thinks, and we're just going to do whatever we want to do. So hopefully, the ICJ has noted that Netanyahu is just spouting complete derision for them and the prospect, the possibility of international law actually having some teeth towards them. People seem to be expecting that provisional measures, which might include a cease and desist order, ordering a ceasefire, to happen potentially in as soon as a week, quite likely by the end of the month. So that isn't the case. The case will go on for years, but the ICJ critically right now has the opportunity to issue an order. South Africa laid out a whole series of provisional measures that they wanted done as soon as possible. And if the ICJ grants them, that will be a major setback for Israeli and U.S. establishment designs.
As far as other European countries weighing in on this, Sam, Germany kind of got the attention of a lot of people, and not in the best possible light. I don't know what your thoughts are, and just explain how that went down, because it was a very uncomfortable position which Germany has taken on this. The backlash has been pretty immense out in the Twitter sphere and so forth. But explain what happened here.
Yeah, well, I mean, very deservedly, they put out a statement and an intention, I believe, to file a formal declaration of intervention in the case on behalf of Israel. And I think the strongest pushback that I've seen was from Namibia, and I was only vaguely aware of this. Germany, which didn't have a lot of colonies, unlike a lot of other European powers, but they had Namibia, and a lot of scholars apparently, connect the Nazi Holocaust to having roots in German atrocities and imperialism against Namibia that apparently had a horrific toll on that country. So, Namibia sort of chimed in and said, "Yeah, So I mean, you got to say, Germany's they're like batting 1,000 here. It's like every major event there. So I mean, getting some pushback on Twitter is I mean, Germany deserves a hell of a lot worse. And it's interesting to me because, I remember Willy Brandt, after the first Gulf War, gave a major speech in Germany saying, we got to fix the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If we let this fester, it's going to have horrific ramifications. Willy Brandt was an anti-fascist that eventually became Chancellor of Germany, and sort of put Germany on a decent course throughout the 60s and 70s. And then when he was sort of in retirement, he came out and gave this major speech in, I guess, 1991. So obviously the German establishment didn't heed that, and they've gone along with the U.S. NATO agenda on so many things, with disastrous consequences for the world and ultimately for Germany.
Yeah, it's. I think the European Union itself has been really exposed through this, but its member states, used to have some degree of independence, but they all seem to be kind of falling in line with the United States. This seems to be a very discernible trend in Europe, and Brussels is trying to marshal a consensus, but Ursula von der Leyen, very unpopular, increasingly so, herself a failed German minister out of the Merkel government. So Europe is not a very good time, I think, for Europe. You could say it's a little bit of the dark ages internationally. So that's very regrettable. I think Germany will regret this move in the future, or future voters and Germans will look back at this as not a good time. Vis-a-vis Ukraine as well. That's another story. But on this issue, we got a couple of minutes left, Sam. So where do you think things are going to go from here? It's already having an effect. A number of the Gulf states, they feel a little bit hemmed in now on this South African move. There's a little bit of a moral cloud hanging over this now that wasn't there before. So while people say, Sam, and they often do, the court has no teeth, the International Courts of Justice is Israel's not going to comply. Look, Netanyahu is basically thumbing his nose at it already. It does have an effect, though, politically, doesn't it, Sam? Because this does sort of set the tone for the global consensus. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. This is an opportunity for the global South to unite and assert itself in a meaningful way. It exposes the Arab governments and regimes as, why did South Africa do it? Why didn't all of you guys do it? So it puts the onus on them. It puts onus on institutions. I couldn't get Al Jazeera English to make a single mention of the possibility of invoking the Genocide Convention, and I tried over and over again since October until when South Africa finally invoked it. I couldn't get Al Jazeera English to talk about the possibility of a country invoking Genocide Convention at the ICJ until South Africa did it, and then they reported on, and they didn't report on it very prominently at first. So it really exposes a lot of the machinations of these Gulf and other Arabic states. And it also puts a lot of Europeans in a bind, too, because they're supposed to stand up for international law. I mean, you expect the U.S. Establishment not to care, but the European countries pretend to care about international law. And so it exposes them as well. And I mean, there could be some movement. Some activists are trying to get Belgium or Spain or potentially Ireland. There's a lot of movement in Ireland, but the government is obstinate to file. And, in a sense, I think in terms of the activism, all activism is good because you could potentially, stop countries from doing bad interventions, even the bad one, let's say Canada, for example, at least, get them to shut the hell up. I think there's a mindset that some activists might have in pushing them. I think this strips a layer. And, in terms of its, there are things, I don't know if we got the time for another minute or two here, but.
Yeah, go ahead, Sam. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, this could, the next steps, if the ICJ, and we don't know that it'll do this, we don't know what'll happen. I mean, the judges are under tremendous pressure, I'm sure, and they could fold. Or all kinds of deals could be struck. They could be being blackmailed for all I know, as we've known in prior cases. I think we talked about that last week. But if the ICJ does issue provincial orders against Israel, potentially even saying, you have to do a ceasefire, it would go to the Security Council. Now, the U.S. presumably would veto it. I think this will dramatically escalate the diplomatic costs and political costs against the United States. It would buttress all kinds of other things, like the BDS movement against Israel, for example. So it would have those ramifications. But legally, then the General Assembly can attempt to seize control of the matter. And they can do very concrete things using Uniting for Peace. They could suspend Israel from activities at the General Assembly. I don't think they can kick Israel out of the UN altogether, but they can suspend them from activities. They could admit Palestine as a full-fledged voting member of the United Nations. And they could also create a tribunal, since the International Criminal Court has refused to do its job and look at criminal activity by Israel or any NATO or pro-US government at all. they could set up a tribunal. In the past, these tribunals were created by the General Assembly on Rwanda and Yugoslavia, but there's nothing stopping the General Assembly from creating a tribunal that would go after individuals. So that is one other thing. So you could have South Africa leading the way at the General Assembly to, to begin to show cracks in the U.S. dominated international order. And, as a member of BRICS, as a member of the Global South, this could be, a major step in terms of how world affairs are configured.
Yeah, and those wheels will continue to turn in the coming weeks and months. So this is, get ready, this is a long-term issue. It's not going to go away. It will continue smoldering in the background as time goes by. Even if there's a ceasefire, all these legal moves, all of these sort of processes will still continue behind the scenes. And it really depends on the political will of the international community to make all that happen. But Sam Husseini, journalist, thank you for joining us. And do follow Sam's work on Substack as well as on X Twitter. We've tagged him on our Twitter feed at 21Wire. Follow Sam, follow his work, subscribe to his Substack column. It is excellent, essential source of information, especially on this issue. Sam, thanks for joining us on TNT this week.
Always a pleasure, Patrick. Thank you.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Sam Husseini, journalist based in Washington, D.C. Let's take a break right now with the network. And when we come back, we'll get a reaction on this topic and other news from our roving correspondent, Basil Valentine, on the other side. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. We'll be right back.